Hi, I'm Valerie Englehart, and in this video I am starting big. So I showed off a size 16 squirrel mop brush, and this brush is huge because I am working on a huge piece of paper. This is the largest block I could buy at 18 by 24 inches, and it is Arches Rough Press. I have sped this video up like 300% because this painting, even though it took me a few days to do over various sessions because I would have to let layers dry, the recording was over 2 hours. And so I don't think you want to see every brush stroke for 2 hours, so I sped it up considerably, but not so much that you can't tell what's going on. So I am starting with one of my favorite things to do, and that is to do a wash over the paper. And it just gives a really beautiful, colorful background, lots of textures that I can use to reference shapes, so it makes it easier for me to paint since I don't sketch first. And I am putting on just 3 colors. I am using Rockwell Art Palaiba Diamond Blue, Daniel Smith Quinacridone Burnt Orange, and Daniel Smith Rose of Ultramarine. I will be pulling out quite a few more colors when I start painting my actual subject, but for now I want to keep my background fairly uncluttered and vibrant. So I am placing my colors deliberately. I want that blue to be the background. The orange area is going to be where the majority of my subject is, and then I put the purple towards the bottom because that is part of the subject too and still nice and warm, but I didn't want there to be a lot of bright colors at the bottom because I wanted to pull the eye more towards the middle of the piece. I am adding salt because I love to add salt, and I am painting on an angle. Because of that, all of the water flowed to the bottom, so I lift it up, let things move back, and periodically I will mop up some excess water from the bottom. Now notice, whenever I pulled out my mop brush, I had to use my hand to squeeze out the extra water because this thing holds a lot of water. That was the point. But moisture control is very important in watercolor. And if you heard that, that was Chai. Hello, Chai. Have anything to say? Nope. All right, we're gonna keep going. And I did use a mix of salt. I used mostly my kosher table salt, but I also used some silk jacquard salt. Now that the painting has dried, I have turned it upside down, and I am using Bloodstone Genuine by Daniel Smith to create the kind of dark, grungy textured background. Now, I haven't yet even told you what I'm painting. I am painting a character named Esquie from the game Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Now, if you saw my video a couple videos ago, I had painted a tiger wearing a pirate hat, assuming that a game for Games Done Quick was going to be run, and I was wrong. It's not going to be run in this event. So I needed to come up with another painting for a game in the event, and one of the biggest games that came out recently is Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and it caught the gaming world by storm. There was no real marketing involved prior, no big fanfare. It was just kind of quietly released, and it took off, and it is a beautiful game. And dare I say, there are some really great comedic moments. And Esquie is one of those comedic figures. He is giant, and he's just, I guess, whimsical. Don't eat that, Chai. No. Sorry, my cat is trying to eat my paint because I'm not paying attention to him. Anyway, he's this giant, sweet, cute, I don't even know how else to describe him except he makes me feel wee. But this game is very beautiful. I love the scenery and the character designs, the monster designs, and the music. The score is moving. I could put it on and just listen to it all day long. And little thing about the game, it is incredibly French. I wouldn't even need to tell you that this is French. You would start the game and be like, oh yes, this is overwhelmingly French. But I'm getting too much into the game and not enough into my technique. I put that Bloodstone Genuine in the background, and when I turned my paper back over, I softened that line to allow that Bloodstone Genuine to come into my figure. And he's got like these sleeves on the side, these really puffy sleeves. And so I'm using Bloodstone Genuine to be some of those darkest shadows. And I've also got some Piemontite Genuine because I wanted that brown, but a very red brown. And so a lot of the colors in this, even though it is a dark painting, it's a very warm painting. And I'm using a flat brush right now. This is a Mimic, probably like 3/4 of an inch, maybe a full inch. And right now I'm using these big sweeping brush strokes to create the folds of the fabric on Esquie. And normally I like to paint very quickly, and it looks like I'm painting quickly, but I actually really took my time with this piece because I wanted it to go right. And this piece needed a lot of layers, like so many layers. And usually watercolor is worked in layers, and I think most paintings are worked with layers. But I used more layers in this piece than I usually use. But if you saw the thumbnail, I mean, it turns out super great, so I was happy with it. I will say, as cool as all of that salt texture is, most of it does end up covered. So did I need to have the salt? Probably not. But even just having it helps me place my shapes because I don't use a sketch. I do have a reference image on my tablet off screen. Now, unlike usual, I did not put things in black and white. It's a very dark reference image, and so I let it be as it was and just decided to use my imagination to fill in the colors and the light and the dark. One thing about fabric folds is sometimes when you look at them, they can be a bit overwhelming and chaotic, but typically they will fold in a pattern, in something that if you really just take the time to observe them, it's not as chaotic as it appears at first. So in this case, he's kind of leaning forward, and so the folds of the garment all fold almost in a V shape toward the center. And I'm not too concerned with how the very center of the painting is because I'm going to go over the face area and the center with watercolor ground later. So anything that I put down is going to get covered anyway, so I'm not too concerned about that very center strip of the painting. Now, one thing I didn't point out is I threw a little bit of Daniel Smith Undersea Green up on the shoulder and then kind of in the crease on the left side. I added some green because this painting, even though I never use the color red, there are a lot of red tones because I'm using Piemontite Genuine that has red. I'm using Fuchsite Genuine, a red. I'm using a Perylene Violet, which leans red, and that orange. So even though I'm not actually using red, there's a lot of red. And so with green being the opposite of red, I wanted to add some green to give some visual interest, but not a lot because it's good to have something dominate the painting. So these warm tones dominate, these reddish tones dominate. So I don't want to have a lot of green, just a little bit for some visual interest. And also to show that I'm not afraid to throw in a complementary color. But it is important to choose the right green. How did I do that? Well, one is I paint a lot, so I kind of just knew. But that doesn't help you, does it? So what I do is I have a scrap of paper, and I noticed with all of these red tones, most of them were more on the moody or earthy side. So when choosing a green, I went with something kind of moody and earthy. And because the rest of the painting was warm, I decided to go with a warmer green. That way it wouldn't clash so badly. Even the blue I use is a warmer blue. So I wanted to go with a warmer green, and undersea green has these yellow tones in them. But just to make sure I like it, I usually keep a scrap piece of paper, and before I do any painting, especially a big important painting like this where I'm going to be using a lot of pigment, like I kept having to squeeze out more Bloodstone Genuine. Big paper like this uses a lot of paint. So I'll grab a scrap piece of paper and I will test my colors on it. I'll even do like a little mock painting, like a study. Super small, like maybe 2 inches by 4 inches. And that lets me know if the colors work and do I feel good about them, because if I don't like how it looks on my little like 4x6 square, oh, it's not even 4x6, like 2x4 square, then there's no way I'm gonna like it on my big painting. And if I'm not excited about my colors, then it's gonna be a slog to get through a painting. And if I'm not excited, that might come through. Maybe the viewer won't be excited. Maybe you wouldn't be excited to watch this and learn what to do. I can't have that. So get any of your questions, any technique questions, any possible mistakes, dare I say, on just a little scrap piece of paper first. Save yourself the time, the heartache, and honestly, the money. Because this big piece of paper, hello chai, but this big piece of paper isn't cheap. These paints aren't cheap. And while I definitely agree with paint's only wasted if it stays in the tube and that you learn from mistakes, absolutely. But I don't want to just waste things unnecessarily. And also, it kind of hits the ego. It doesn't feel good to start something big and then not like it. And then have that feeling of obligation of like, oh, well, I have to finish it because reasons. So long story short, just do a quick little test on a scrap piece of paper, and that will tell you what you need to know about how your pigments work together before you ever go to the big piece. Now, as we're moving on, I just keep layering. So as the painting dries, I add more darks, I might glaze certain areas, and this is all still part of this second layer. Because this painting is so big, I can work on a section, let it dry slightly so that it's damp but not sopping wet, and then go back to it. That is an advantage of working so large, is that I don't have to take a ton of breaks. I can work a segment, move to another segment, and then by the time I'm done with the second segment, that first one might be dry enough to keep going. But that is also part of why I'm using the Mimic flat brush, is it doesn't hold a ton of water. I need water control. I need enough water to cover a great amount of space, especially with this being rough paper. But if it's sopping wet, I'm still working at an angle. It could create a mess and mud. Oh, by the way, those sleeves, they're puffy. So I'm using rounded brush strokes when I do them. And I'm making sure to have the shadows be in the crease and then toward the edge of the paper. That way, with the dark on either side, the light in the center makes it pop, creating the illusion of a rounded form. Now I have, at this point, step back and let it dry. Sometimes you hit a point where you really just need to let the whole thing dry and come back with fresh eyes. And honestly, if something's not working right in your painting, before you despair, put it away and take a break. Leave for an hour and come back. Sometimes even leave for a day and come back. But in this case, I'm feeling good. I'm gonna keep going. I have a silver black velvet brush, and this one is probably my size 12. I usually use a size 8, but this painting is so big that I'm going in with my size 12. And I'm just using the same colors over and over, deepening my shadows and making some shapes more pronounced, like the lapel that's going off on the side. But one thing to be careful of is, so I've already basically covered my entire first layer, but that first layer was still important because bits of it are shining through. It was a foundation for me to work on. And like, look at the top of Esquie. Some of that blue is shining through, and I like that because it creates like that cooler color that recedes. So be careful not to cover everything. Or even if you do cover it, watercolor is transparent, maybe keep that area a little more watery so some of that initial layer shines through. That is one of the beautiful things about watercolor with its transparency, is you can still create shape and form and shadows and light, but you can still see where you started. And whenever I've painted and ended up covering everything completely to where my initial layer is unrecognizable, usually bums me out. Maybe you like to paint like that, in which case, go for it, you do you, but it bums me out. So just that little tiddly bit of advice. Now, one other thing to mention is, how do I choose what color to put where? Why are some of my shadows Bloodstone Genuine, and yet in other areas I go in with the Perylene Violet? Well, in some cases, it's as we get closer to the focal point, which is going to be Esquie's face, I want there to be the greatest amount of contrast of light and dark, because that will draw the eye. And in other cases, it becomes just as simple as, oh, I haven't used this color in a while, and I don't want to use the same color all the time for every shadow. That's feeling kind of boring. And I don't want to feel bored. So sometimes it really is just a gut feeling, and you'll have your own colors that you gravitate to. You can get these overall effects of light and dark with really just about any colors. Granted, if you want certain granulation effects, you will want to use granulating paint. If you want that glowing quinacridone look, then yeah, use a quinacridone paint. But you don't have to have the exact same materials that I do to get the feeling of such a work. Now, what I did there was I glazed the sleeve. I was feeling it wasn't, I guess, orange or red enough, and so I just glazed it with some of that quinacridone burnt orange color to tint it. But now I am going in and I'm putting on all of the gilded gold detail. And I am using, this flat brush of mine is actually really ragged and split, but that's fine because Esquie is so old and I'm doing it on fabric, and fabric can be frayed, and the folds of fabric and everything, like, sometimes you want things to look really perfect, clean, and crisp. I did not want perfect, clean, and crisp. So going in with a splayed brush worked really well for me, but also because I am working with watercolor ground. And so if that was going to damage my brush, I wanted to use a brush that I didn't care about. Now, I went ahead and spared you because that segment took a long time, but all I did was eyeball putting in like these embroidered details on Esquie's outfit. And because this is watercolor ground, you can paint on top of it. And so I've grabbed a brush that I really don't care about. And why is that? Because I was naughty. You're really supposed to let watercolor ground dry naturally for 24 hours. But because I did such a thin layer, I decided, YOLO, I'm just gonna hit it with a blow dryer and keep going because I'm impatient. So I did. But then I used a brush I don't really care about, because if for some reason that watercolor ground were to still be wet, it would get mixed in with my brush. And if I didn't notice it at some point, that could damage the brush. So I'm not gonna use one of my expensive, lovely, soft, natural fiber brush. I'm going to use this one that I never use because I don't even like it that much. So keep some of those brushes around. Keep some materials around that you don't like, because you might hit a point like this where you want to do something but you don't want to ruin your good stuff. And the reason I'm painting on top of the embroidery is to create more of that shadow. That gold sits on top, and I wanted to show that I wanted to push some of it into the background. So Esquie has like this radiating sun coming out from around his face. Now, I didn't get the proportions completely correct, and that is where being an artist is fine. I'm not doing this to be completely accurate. I am giving my feeling, my take, my technique on this character. So as long as I get the feeling right, get those radiating lines in various lengths correct, most sane people are not going to go and count exactly how many exactly how thin or long or the angle. Just get the feeling right. And I also chose watercolor ground because the gouache I have wasn't as bright and eye-catching as I wanted it to be. The watercolor gold that I have wouldn't be opaque enough. And I do have some like gold leaf, but I wanted some textured brush strokes because part of Clair Obscur is everything is kind of art-based. Like, there are creatures that are modeled after mannequins that would be used for like drawing studies, and their heads are like paintbrushes. And even the name Clair Obscur is a term for like the haziness and like a disappearing point in painting. I should probably actually like get the real definition up, but it is a painting term. And also it just sounds really cool. And like literally Clair, like clear, obscure. We know what obscure means, right? Anyway, I wanted everything to be very brush stroked. So even the gold like filigree going on the outfit, I used some dry brushing, and I didn't want things to be super perfect. I wanted them to look like I painted it. Now, I was a little concerned for a second about trying to eyeball a round shape because I don't draw circles super well. And I could have gone in and like used a bowl, which is what I had thought about doing, or even like a compass to get a perfectly round form. But again, I was like, you know what? I haven't been perfect about anything else. Why start now? Because the watercolor ground does dry pretty flat, even though you do get those brushstroke textures, I don't get the variation of tone like I do for watercolor paint. And so I decided, let's go grab some of this liquid gold leaf that I got for my birthday and try to add some gold dimension, go gold on gold, but this gold is a much colder color. And the applicator is a lot like that little brush that comes in a nail polish bottle. In fact, it even has a little ball inside. I had to shake it like you would a bottle of nail polish. And I'm not being precise here either. Kind of broken strokes, keeping in that radiated form. All right, so now I'm going to do Esquie's face. And he kind of looks like his head looks like porcelain. And so I wanted it to be textured. So I'm going in with a oval, flat palette knife, and I am scooping out Daniel Smith titanium white watercolor ground. And again, I haven't drawn anything, I am winging it. Now, spoiler alert, I was planning to do part of it in the ground and then pull out some crackle paste because I was like, ooh, and I've got the jar over on the side. Crackle paste will look so good having that weathered look to it. Oh, I was so excited. And then I opened up my crackle paste and it was all dry. I couldn't reconstitute it, I couldn't use it, and I was fuming. But I already had like 3/4 of his face in. So I just went in and did the whole thing in watercolor ground, keeping circular strokes. And that's one thing if you want to use this as a texture and not just as a surface prep. So you notice I'm using, for the strip that goes down the middle of him, I've grabbed this like flat angled palette knife because this is a rectangular strip. I want it to be very straight. And so when I'm doing my strokes, I am doing it up and down primarily because I want that texture. But for his head, because his head is round, I used rounded, curved strokes of the palette knife with an oval knife just to keep everything nice and round. And because this is all watercolor ground, it's considered a surface prep. For most watercolor competitions, that would not count as mixed media, so I could still use it. So I used a lot of different brushes on this painting. I pulled out my size 10 Princeton Neptune because it's nice and soft and I understand its water control and it's big enough for me to work with. So that watercolor ground is a very stark white as compared to like the rest of my painting, which is really dark and grungy. So I am covering that white with the Bloodstone Genuine. And now that there's pigment that can seep into the cracks and textures that I made, you can really see what a difference it makes, keeping things from being smooth. Now, if you wanted this to be smooth, you could get a fine bit of sandpaper and buff it out, make it nice and smooth, but I don't want that. I want texture. Now, even though it's watercolor ground, it's a surface prep, it accepts watercolor. It's not as absorbent, it doesn't behave exactly the same as cotton paper. So anytime I put color on it, it dries a lot paler than it would on the paper. So I go in really dark. And there are so many times where I lift it with water because I'm like, oh, that's way too dark. And yet it dries quickly and shows, no, you can go a little darker. So when working on watercolor ground, don't be afraid to go bold with your values because they will dry a lot lighter. And I'm just placing the idea of where his face goes and how it's shaped. While that area dries, I'm moving on to that banner that goes down his center, and I've gone back to the Daniel Smith Rose of Ultramarine. So part of the reason I want to use it on the banner is I have that color elsewhere in the painting, even if it's really subdued. So this way we still have color harmony because that color does exist elsewhere in the painting. But right here, because it's on a white surface, it's really going to pop compared to everything else. Also, I love how this turned out. Having that vertical texture from the watercolor ground, putting on really thick, like I squeezed out fresh pigment, and it takes a lot to cover this, so don't be shy about squeezing that tube. But there's all these little nooks and crannies and crevices, and I gotta fill it all with paint, and I don't have to pay a lot of attention due to the uneven surface. It dries unevenly in a way that has a real organic look to it. And I love that person. Like, I love that. So I'm going back up to that radiating headpiece and adding more Bloodstone Genuine using it's a liner brush. I don't remember the brand offhand. It's like Zen Art. I got it a long time ago to use with gouache. But I'm adding some texture and separation. It's just even with that other gold that I added, it was still too flat. So just go in. I got to listen to so many podcasts while doing this piece. I might have condensed this video down to roughly half an hour, but it took a while. Remember, what I'm doing right now is sped up by 300%. In reality, I took my sweet time and enjoyed every brush stroke. All right, flat brush again because I'm going to do his eyes, and his eyes are just a pair of really thin rectangles. And then his nose and mouth are both essentially just triangles, but their widths and lengths are different, and it's important to make sure that they are placed properly compared to the eyes. So I was really paying attention to my reference image to make sure, like, how far up does the nose go? How wide is that mouth? And I like that because the ground doesn't absorb super well, and that it is so textured, I was able to make the nose look really cool, even though I didn't make it intentionally like that, but it already looks like it's popping off the page. And then around Esquie's face are these lines. I'm putting them in, but as you can see, some of them are starting to bleed and feather. But that's okay. I'm going for a really loose look, and I'm fine with it. It all really comes together in the end, so just trust the process. Once his face was in, I decided he needed a little more shadow. Because even though that face is white, I didn't want it to be too stark, especially with everything else being kind of grungy. Now he has these marks on his face that are more, so in the reference photo, it's actually a gray color, but I've not used gray in my painting, and I want to bring some warmth to the face, so I'm using that Piemontite Genuine. And I don't think anyone's going to complain. I think it looks great. Kind of looks like little rosy cheeks. Now I'm going back in with the watercolor ground in gold. I use a lot of this gold watercolor ground in this painting, and it's fun. And by painting on ground, I get this really cool 3D texture. And it's something that we'll never be able to, well, I guess I can't say never, but I can't replicate that on a print. So it makes the original work of art that much more unique. He's got gold accents on either side of that banner, so I'm using the ground to paint that on. And then there are these symbols, and I just eyeball them. I've been painting long enough where I don't sketch anything out that I was pretty confident with these basic shapes. It's mostly triangles, rectangles, slanted lines. What was really important was making sure I got the proportions right to each other. And that comes with practice. Sometimes painting without a sketch is really intimidating, especially in the beginning. But the more you do it, the better you get at seeing, at making these judgment calls. So basically, like anything else, it just takes practice. If it's something you want to do, you can do it. I couldn't do this right away the first time I tried. I mean, I could, but it didn't look that good. I just didn't let it stop me. All right, so this was a bravery test for me. I wanted Esquie to be wearing a band on his head that had the 33 patch to show that he had joined the 33rd Expedition. And so I globbed on that watercolor ground because I wanted real texture, and I'm using that palette knife to create like folds of fabric. But not only is he an important character, I mean, the subtitle is Expedition 33. So after globbing on that really thick band, I scrape off some of it in a rectangle because that's where the patch is going to go. And it's like a leather patch that has the number on it. But yeah, definitely a bravery test because he was looking good. And I could have left it off and people would still know exactly who that character is. But what's art if we're not a little brave? But I did have to let this dry naturally. There was no way a blow dryer was going to take care of that. So I had to wait a full 24 hours. And then I came back and went in with Pymatite Genuine to do the patch. Went over the fabric with more of that gold watercolor ground, and then used that same watercolor ground to paint in the number 33 on the patch. Here's the finished painting! So if you liked this video, press that like button so I know to make more like it, and if you've got any games that you'd like to see me make some fan art for, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!